I'd like to begin by asking you to give us your name, when and where you were born, and a little bit about your parents.
My name is James William Haley, Jr. I was born September 28, 1942 in Washington, D.C. And my parents were both attorneys. My father was the Vice President General Counsel of the National Coal Association and then of private coal companies, and my mother was actually the second lady attorney hired by the Department of the Treasury. But she, after I was born and a sister, she stopped working for them.
So tell me a little bit about their background, their names, and when and where they were born, if you remember.
My father's name was James William Haley. He was born in Fauquier County, Virginia, but was raised in Front Royal, Virginia. And my mother was raised on a farm in Towanda, Illinois. And they met in undergraduate school at George Washington University and went through there and then to law school too.
Now, it was very unusual for a woman to go to law school at that time, so tell me a little bit about your mother.
Well, my mother met my father when they were freshmen in undergraduate school at GW, and my father said he wasn't going to get married till he got through law school, so she figured she might as well go too. Keep an eye on him, maybe. And so she did.
And so did they have any other children?
I have two sisters.
And what are their names?
Two younger sisters.
What are their names?
Joan Eleanor Haley and Janet Haley Hawes, two younger sisters.
And how much younger are they?
One sister is 3 years younger, and the other is 7 years younger.
And so tell me what it was like growing up in the Haley household with two professional parents.
Well, it was wonderful. We lived in Arlington County. I was raised in Arlington County, and in a beautiful old Victorian house on 3 acres, and house I absolutely loved. And so it was a wonderful upbringing. Very happy.
Where did you go to school?
I went to I went to St. Agnes through the 2nd grade, which is Episcopalian boys and girls school then, and then I went to St. Stephen's Episcopal School for boys, all boys, 3rd grade through 12th grade in Alexandria. And they are now joined, so it's a co-ed prep school now.
And were there any teachers who really influenced your life?
Yes, an English professor named Willis Wills, who taught you how to write a sentence, and I had to write an essay every week for him, and he was the enormous impact on my life and on the lives of a whole lot of people.
Tell me a little bit about him.
Well, he was a graduate of the University of Richmond, right up the road, and he was a professor of English with the classic tweed jacket with the elbows, and smoked a pipe, and he was known as the Wicked Wasp of Twickenham after Alexander Pope, because he was a little person, but he absolutely commanded your respect, and not as a disciplinarian, but just that you didn't want to do something to disappoint him. And he was a very, very fine English teacher. And as a matter of fact, he's long dead, but the library at St. Stephen's, St. Agnes is named after him. And he was a great man.
What are some of the things that he really taught you?
How to, well, of course, how to write a grammatically correct sentence, but how to don't use unnecessary words, write clearly, tautly, with balance, and of course transition. You go from one paragraph to another so it flows. But That's what he taught me.
Do you feel like you may have had a talent in writing before his class, and then his class really honed those skills, or did he kind of take a rough diamond and really help?
Well, it might have been rough, but I'm sure it wasn't a diamond. I don't know. I founded the literary magazine in high school, and for 4 consecutive years in high school, I won the English award. So. But that, you know.
So you said you founded a literary magazine?
Yeah, the literary magazine.
Tell me a little bit about that. What propelled you to do that, and
I thought we ought to have one, and so I got the idea and started it and asked students to make contributions, and we published it quarterly.
So was reading very important growing up in your household?
Yes, very important.
And what kinds of things did you read?
Oh, goodness. Everything. You mean as a kid?
Mm-hmm.
Well, of course, you read all the Hardy Boys. You read all the Nancy Drew, even though it was a girl. Read all of Zane Grey, and you know, as a kid, you know, and you know, every kid's book, you know, read them all.
Were your favorites the mystery stories?
Well, you know, I guess up until you get to be, till you start reading something worthwhile, you know, until you're, 13 or 14 and find out, yes, there is real literature, yes. But yeah, I guess they were. And then there were, golly, what was his name? Oh, they were from the 20s and 30s. Jack somebody and his this, and I can't remember the name, but anyway, you know, kids, boys, stuff.
Were you involved with clubs growing up?
Clubs?
Yes, like maybe the Boy Scouts
I was
or...
a Cub Scout, Boy Scout, yeah. Not a very good one. I was never an Eagle or anything.
And what about in school? What kind of clubs did you join?
Well, I got 7 varsity letters. I mean, you know, in football, baseball, and soccer, and clubs. Drama club. I acted in a couple plays for the heck of it.
What plays were there?
Oh, one was a play called by W.W. Jacobs, I believe his name was, called The Monkey's Paw, which was just what the heck? Why not give it a try?
So what I'm hearing is you liked a very expansive life, that you tried a lot of different things.
Yeah. I mean, that's what life is about.
Did you and your family travel when you were growing up?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's funny. Earlier, prior to beginning this interview, we talked, and I can remember going to Virginia Beach when you had to take a car ferry across before there was any bridge tunnel. And I can remember that car ferry, you know, going from Hampton Roads across the bay. And there also used to be a car ferry that left from Washington, D.C., an overnight ferry that would come down with your car on and let you off on the Virginia Beach side. But yeah, I remember going to Virginia Beach often. And family picnics.
Were there any particular activities that you continued throughout your life and career that you started when you were younger?
Well, I'm 71, and until about 10 years ago, yeah, baseball. Yeah, playing ball. Yeah, that, and you know, reading, which you get to a certain age, You know, you can't pick up ground balls like you used to, and you swing it any good anymore. And so, about 10 years ago, I said, I've had it. But yeah, that baseball was my great love all the way through. College, law school, working, yeah.
And what about reading? Your favorite authors or genres?
Ooh. Gee, that's a very hard question. Fiction, I presume, it would be my favorite, and modern fiction. I mean, you can't get much better than Faulkner. I've been to his home in Mississippi. I don't know, three books come to mind that one book called Fortitude by Hugh Walpole, which was written around the turn of the century, and the first line of which has always meant a lot to me. And it is, "'Tisn't life that matters, 'tis the courage that you bring to it." A great book. Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man is a great book. Malcolm Lowry's Under the Volcano is a wonderful book, but fiction, I guess, contemporary fiction.
And so it sounds as if some of these books have meant something to you in the way that you view things.
Well, yeah, they give you a perspective on life and make life, as Plato said, you know, the unexamined life, you know, you need to examine life. For those reasons, I think.
Do you think that some of that propelled you to go to law school, or do you think you were more influenced by your parents?
Probably both. Probably both. I mean, you know, my parents were lawyers, but they weren't lawyers in the sense of the word that I became a lawyer. My father was a lobbyist, you know, and a coal company executive, basically. And so they weren't lawyers in the sense of the word. You're out trying cases.
At home, did your parents come and you heard them talking about perhaps their day and the activities of their day, any legal discussions?
No, I don't remember any legal discussions. No, I don't remember. I mean, they wasn't, you know, neither one was practicing law, so it wasn't, so they weren't those kind of discussions.
So tell me what happened after high school.
Well, went off and worked for the Geological Survey in the summer as a rod man in Ohio, and went off to Washington Lee undergraduate school. And
what made you decide to go to Washington and Lee?
The president and owner of my father's coal company was chairman of the board of trustees of Washington Lee. His name was Houston St. Clair. And he was sort of determined that I was going to go to Washington Lee. And I was accepted and wanted to go to Princeton, but ended up at Washington Lee. And you know, joined a fraternity. And
what fraternity was
Beta
that?
Theta Phi.
And so the decision to go to Washington and Lee was somewhat influenced?
Oh yes, I think it was influenced by yes. It was, I mean, I applied there, wonderful school, but yes, it was forces beyond my control, perhaps we should say.
And so were there any professors, classes, or activities that really influenced you in college?
Well, I had some great history teachers, really good history teachers, and a wonderful professor of political science named Milton Colvin, and history teacher named T.P. Hughes was one of them, and but that got me for a great love, become a lifelong love of French history, believe it or not. But anyway, which I still read. Well, that and sports and Hollins, Sweetbriar. You know, Washington Lee was all male then, in those days. And that outsmarting yourself, I took an extra course, both sophomore year, both semester sophomore years, both semester junior year, and first semester my senior year. So only needed 3 hours to graduate. So the second semester of my senior year, I was going to spend doing fun things. Signed up for one course, a film course. And I got a call from a dean, Mr. Haley. Yes, sir. You've only signed up for one course. I said, that's right. That's all I need to graduate, 3 hours. He said, Washington Lee's got no part-time students. You got to take 15 hours. So that was 2.5 years worth of work thrown away. And you know, I could have signed up and never gone, but I wanted to go to law school, and that wasn't going to help your grade point average any. So I ended up having a work. So I could have chose. I ended up being able to choose in what field I wanted to take my degree, because I had enough hours for 3 majors. Talk about outsmarting yourself. What
were those 3 majors you had enough hours for?
Economics, philosophy, and political science, and history. But I chose economics. Figured if I needed to get a job, that would be a better degree to have.
And so you finished that additional semester with all those classes. I assume you did well.
Well, I was graduating with honors, yeah.
And had you made a decision about your next step?
Yes, I was going to law school.
And did any of your professors make suggestions about law school or future careers, or you had already made up your mind?
I had a political science professor who nominated me for a Fulbright. And I got to the quarterfinals, but I wanted to go to the Sorbonne, but I wasn't the only person who wanted to go to the Sorbonne. And then he wanted me to do a graduate degree in, it was a Washington Lee Fellowship to do some history thing. Anyway, but no, I said, no, I want to get on to law school. That's what I want to do.
So you had an option to take the Fulbright?
No, I got to the quarterfinals, but no, if that option had arisen, I'd speak much better French than I do today, which is poor.
So did you think about different law schools, or did you have your heart set on just one?
I only applied to Virginia. That's where I wanted to go. And
Why UVA?
because I think then, as I do now, that Virginia, all things considered, might be the finest law school in the United States. Unlike some law schools up north that may claim otherwise. But at Virginia, you learn some law. And anyway, that's still my view. But
And you intended on practicing law here in Virginia?
Yeah, I wanted to stay in Virginia.
Did you envision that you would be actually practicing law unlike your parents?
Yes. Yeah, I wanted to be a practicing lawyer.
And what kind of law did you envision yourself as practicing?
Whoa. Well, so much of that is, I want to do trial work. And so much of that is, what is your first job? But I wanted to do trial work, is what I wanted to do. And
what attracted you to trial work?
I don't know. I think, you think of a lawyer, you think of somebody trying cases,
A Perry Mason type?
well, I don't know about Perry Mason, but trying cases, you know. They're, where there are no excuses, you know. You either win it or you lose it. And nobody to blame really but yourself. And that's a test of responsibility.
So there was a competitiveness that was a part of the way you wanted?
Yeah, I think very much so, yeah. I think it's part of, yeah, you're right.
So I assume that by the time you got into your second and third year, you enjoyed the trial experiences?
Well, there weren't really any trial experiences.
Well, the mock trial experience.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did. My economic situation was such that I had to work every summer, and I had to pay my way through law school. My family's economic circumstances were, and so I paid my way through law school. By working this summer and working, my last 2 years I taught school from 8 until 10 every morning, 5 days a week. Made $4 an hour, made $8 a day. And so I was unable to attend classes before 11 o'clock at law school, but I studied hard outside of class.
So is this a private school?
Yeah, it was something called that was back during the war, the Vietnam War, and it was a business school, and business schools were booming then because you could stay out of the draft, called Jefferson Professional Institute in downtown Charlottesville, and I taught economics and business law there. Made $40 a week.
And so that helped you to get through law school, and this you did the entire time you were in law school?
Mm-hmm. Not my first year. Second and third years I was teaching at JPI.
And so tell me a little bit about some professors at the law school who really inspired you.
Oh, some really great professors. Tom Bergen, Dick Howard. I mean, Dick Howard was on the same day had an editorial in the Washington Post and the Times-Dispatch praising him when the Virginia Constitution of 1970 was adopted. Now that's hard to do, to get those two publications to praise you.
And what were they praising him about?
He had, in essence, written the recent adoption by referendum of the Constitution of Virginia in 1970. Dick Howard had written it. But yeah, some very great professors. Hardy Dillard, who was a legend and dean of the law school. Those three particularly come to mind.
What was it that they really taught you?
It's a very interesting question about law schools. Well, the first thing they teach you how to think. I am absolutely convinced that lawyers think fundamentally different than other people, and better. I can remember practicing law, and I would have clients who worked at what's called Dahlgren, the Naval Surface Weapons Laboratory in King George, who were physicists and mathematicians. And having a conversation with them about what was legally relevant, very hard. They're probably much smarter than I am, I guess, but they just don't think the same way. And I think that's true of doctors. I mean, they're very able, but I think they teach you how to think, and not just rationality, but a way of analyzing a problem. I've thought for years, I think you could teach people in a law school the law very easily by other than the casebook method. But I am convinced that the casebook method may be best because it teaches you a way of thinking. You know,
give me an example of that.
Well, I could say a contract is composed of an offer and an acceptance. Well, that's what a contract is. That's the law. But when you read case law, what is an offer? And, you know, I can remember reading in first-year contracts, what is an offer? I think there was a old English case in which in the showroom of a window there's an item for sale at the price. Is that an offer? Well, it isn't. It's an invitation to make an offer. And so I think the casebook method gives you examples of what is an offer, what isn't an offer, what's an example. And I think it teaches you a way of thinking that I think is very, very worthwhile. And like I said, you could, I mean, the law of contracts is not that complicated, really. I mean, it is on some levels, but the basic law of contracts is not that complicated. And you could probably write out all the main principles in 2 pages. But to understand how those principles work in the real world is something different anyway.
And so that's really what these 2 professors in particular helped you to understand?
Well, they were just good. They were just good professors. Dick Howard was a great professor. Tom Bergen was a great professor. And then there were older professors who were wonderful. Mr. Nash, Gummy Nash was his nickname. He wrote the first book on Evidence in Virginia and West Virginia. And he was called Gummy because he was a delightful guy. I loved him. But he talked like this. Yes, gentlemen, you must read these cases. And so he was known as Gummy Nash. And he was a wonderful man. He was very old at the time. And then, of course, there was Munford Boyd, who's probably the most revered professor. But Munford Boyd was blind. And just a great, great professor was all. They were just very good, very able. And anyway, it was just what being a professor is all about.
Well, let me ask you, when you were in law school, what was perhaps one of the most challenging experiences that you had?
Secured transactions with Professor Woltz. That was a challenging transaction.
Explain that.
It was UCC on secured transactions. You know, that was a very, very hard course with a very, very tough teacher. But, you know, it's a section of the Uniform Commercial Code. And it was a challenge. Got through it. But that was, I liked law school. I had great fun. Had a great deal of fun in law school.
Explain what you mean.
Well, got married after my 2nd year. It was just developed great friendships. I mean, lifelong friendships. And, you know, we might, from time to time, go out and drink a beer or 2 and party a little. And just good friends. Just people you really genuinely liked.
Now, give me some examples of some of these lifelong friends that you...
Earl Dudley. Earl, a dear friend. He clerked for Warren, then worked for Williams and Conley, and for the last 20 years been a professor at UVA, although he retired year before last. A great, lifelong, great friend.
When did you meet him? Your first year?
Also, first year. The law school was divided up, alphabetized, and I was in Dudley to Lake. And so we were, that quarter of the class, Dudley to Lake. And David Lake is one of the most prominent tax attorneys in Washington, D.C. And so they were just great. Bill Howell, now the Speaker of the House, was my roommate in law school.
This was your first year?
Yeah, first year. Jerry Blouses was a classmate and friend. Jerry and I and my wife and his then wife used to play bridge together. And so it was a wonderful class. They are, how many? A couple of circuit court judges out of my class, 2 or 3 U.S. District Court judges. But just, they were very able people. And sadly, 3 or 4 of my good friends have now died. One a circuit court judge. And so that's always a most saddening event. But I had great fun and great friends from law school.
Now I'd like to back up because you slipped in that you got married during your second year. So I'd like to ask you a little bit about your wife, when you all first met and when you were married.
My wife is a Phi Beta Kappa out of the University of Indiana. Received a scholarship to get a master's in English at Virginia. And I lived my second year, Bill Howell and I were roommates, on what's called University Circle, which is, I wrote over there. And Ann ended up with a roommate in another house about 4 houses away. And goodness, we met in October, engaged in December, and married in June. So met on a blind date, and it was, I was just stunned and remain stunned by her beauty and her intelligence. And so she got her master's, and we were married, and on her birthday, June 10th, 1966, in Arlington, and lived in New Copley Hills down in Charlottesville. And for my last year in law school. She worked as a secretary at Sperry Rand, so I think between us we made about $100 a week with my $40 and her $60, but that was plenty.
So were your parents surprised by the Whirlwind romance?
Yes, I think they were.
But of course, it's obviously lasted a very long time. Did you all have children?
We have 3 children. A daughter, well, that's sort of interesting. We have a daughter who was born in 1967. We got married in June, and she was born on May 8th, and she was way premature. She was about, golly, way premature. Now, you notice it was 10 months, so. But anyway, yeah, 3 pounds, 6 ounces at birth, and 2 pounds, 15. And was at Martha Jefferson Hospital for a month. Just very early birth. And she was supposed to be born in Virginia Beach because I knew I was going to be clerking and living there, you know. And, you know, we had the doctors and everything, the hospital all lined up, and then boom. And she was supposed to be born in July or August. And ended up being born on May 8th, right in the middle of my last exams. And then we have, that's our daughter. And then we have a son who was born 2 years later, who's a lawyer from Virginia. I should say my daughter has 2 degrees from Virginia. Her husband has an undergraduate degree. My son has a law degree from Virginia. And then we have another daughter who's 35, who's got 2 degrees from Virginia, and her husband has an undergraduate degree from Virginia, and so.
And what are your children's names?
My oldest daughter is Laura Haley Lohman. She's in Seattle, Washington, with her husband, 2 boys. My son's is Charles Davis Haley, which is my wife's maiden name, Davis. And he and his son and 2 girls in San Diego, and my youngest and her husband and 2 girls in New York City.
So they're at the different quarters of the country.
Yeah, that's a shame.
So after the trauma of the premature birth of your first child,
That was scary.
and you somehow made it through the exam period, had you already prepared so what you were going to do once you graduated from law school?
Yeah, I knew exactly what I was going to be doing. At that time, you could take the bar in December, and I took it the December before I graduated and passed the bar. So
You already had a position lined up.
Well, I applied for a clerkship with the Fourth Circuit, and was not offered one. And then I got a call from a dean, I can't remember who it was at Virginia Law School, asked if I wanted to be interviewed for a clerkship for the Virginia Supreme Court. I said, sure. And so I went down, I was interviewed and enriched by Justice Gordon, Tom Gordon. And the next thing I knew, I got a call from Judge Eggleston saying, I want you to come to work. And so that was sort of out of the blue. I mean, that was, and I had not given any thought to going to Norfolk or at all, or working for the Virginia Supreme Court. But that was, that was something that doesn't happen very often, to have that happen. And I said, yeah, I'd be honored to. And so at that time we knew, I guess, well, it was certainly before Laura was born, because we'd rented a place in Virginia Beach, and I think it was June 1 I was supposed to start to work. And we had the doctor and the hospital all picked out and in Virginia Beach, and then bang, she was born early. And so I had to go to Virginia Beach and stayed. I had to go to work, and so this little girl was in the hospital for a month. And so Ann stayed up, and I went down to Virginia Beach, where we lived.
So that was a very emotional period for you.
Yeah, I mean, we were scared to death about this little girl, but as a matter of fact, absolutely fine. As a matter of fact, last year, at 44, she ran and finished the New York Marathon. So she's in good shape.
So tell me what the first few months were like being a
Working
clerk.
for
Yes.
Judge Eggleston?
Yes.
Well, it was wonderful. Judge Eggleston's office was in, you have to understand, Norfolk then wasn't like it is now. They didn't have all the high-rises. I guess the first high-rise tall office building was City Hall. And that's where Judge Eggleston's office was. And I can remember this day, for a whole year, you're going to hear the pile driving, when they were putting in the piles for the subsequent. And I think we were on the 8th floor. And it was you came in, and there was a open space, and Judge Eggleston's secretary was there. Judge Eggleston's office was to the right, and my tiny little office was to the left. And the library was in Judge Eggleston's office, all the Virginia reports. And the secretary's name was Mattie Wynn, Miss Mattie Wynn, delightful lady who read mysteries a lot of the time. And my little office was a little cubicle, really, just off the side. So there were only 3 rooms in the office. And of course, at that time, there was no Lexus, there was no case finder. There was the West Digest, West Virginia, and the National Digest, Corpus Juris Secundum and Amjur, and that was, that was about it. And so research was a much different proposition then. And of course, no computers, typewriter, and Anyway, so I get there at 8:30 in the morning, and we closed at 5. I think Miss Wynn, I think, went home early, but so I was like 8 to 35, 5 days a week. And Judge Eggleston was a most elegant, a formal, and a gracious gentleman. He was an enormous influence on my life. And at that time, I was only the 3rd law clerk that he'd had. And, you know, there was no office of the executive secretary. There was the clerk of the court and Mr. Bennett, who was the executive secretary, but he may have had one person and maybe some staff in the clerk's office. In those days, it was the Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals, it was properly called. And everything was by, we call it a writ of error, but everything was certiorari, basically, except for one appeal right from decisions of the State Corporation Commission. And so the way it worked was, as it works now with the Court of Appeals, you would file a petition for a writ with an individual judge. And if it was denied, you had 3 judges hearing, much like we do now. And my job primarily was, I would get the record in, you know, whatever trial it was. It was my job to read every word of it and look at every exhibit and write Judge Eggleston a memorandum, should this writ be granted, yes or no, why? When Judge Eggleston was on the bench, he used to drive the lawyers nuts, but it was wonderful. He'd always say, what's this case all about? What's this case all about? And so I disciplined myself to write in 1 sentence, if I could, maybe 2, the issue or issues. So that that first paragraph might want to be 1 sentence. Judge Eggleston knew right then the answer to what he always asked the lawyers, what's this case all about? And then I would do the research and write a memorandum, either, you know, suggesting you grant the writ or don't grant the writ, and why. And Judge Eggleston, after I provided it for him, he would call me in and ask about it and consider it.
So in a short period of time, he was really dependent on you to provide him with these things, or was he sort of testing you to see how well you understood?
I don't know. I don't think Judge Eggleston is dependent on anybody, ever. No, I mean, when he said, you know, this, I want you to write me something, tell me why, and that was how I did it. And I think he liked it. I mean, he said I was doing really good work. And I think the finest compliment I ever had, Judge Eggleston wanted me to come back for a 2nd year. He asked me, I want you to come back for another year, Jim. And I've regretted that I didn't all my life, because I learned so much. And but when you're young, you know, I want to get on with my career. But I guess he liked what I was doing because he asked me to, you know, come back for another year.
So tell me what he was like as a person.
He was a wonderful person. He was born in 1886. So when I was working for him, he was 81. Absolutely sharp as a tack. I've got some wonderful Judge Eggleston stories. Absolutely sharp as a tack. Very gracious. And very able, very, very able. He knew more Virginia law than anybody ever knew. He had gone he was a state senator from Norfolk. He'd gone on the bench in 1936, as the same day as did Vernon Spratley, who was on the court at the time. But they elected Judge Eggleston first, because at that time, and up until recently, whoever was senior automatically became Chief Justice, and they wanted to make sure that if the time ever rolled around, Judge Eggleston was going to be Chief Justice. And a wonderful story. When we had a court here in Richmond, in the old Supreme Court building, the judges were out front, of course, but there was a big red curtain behind them. And if you were sitting back there as law clerk behind the curtain taking notes on what the lawyers were arguing. And at that time, the youngest member of the court, the junior member, was Harry Carrico, who the greatest Chief Justice in the history of Virginia. But he was the youngest member of the court, and the junior member. But Vernon Spratley was always cold. His legs were cold. And so in the bench, he had an electric heater that he put his feet on. And it would be hotter than heck. And as senior, he was sitting on Judge Eggleston's right. And I can remember Judge Eggleston saying, "Vernon, turn that damn heater off. I'm burning up. Vernon, turn that thing off." In between arguments, "Turn that damn thing off, Vernon." Because it was so hot out there. Oh, and during my year, Albertus Harrison came on the court as a justice. And the wonderful thing about Judge Harrison was so gracious. I mean, you know, every day we'd have lunch. Oh, in a place called Snug Harbor. Every day we'd have lunch. And I always got soup, and he'd, "Oh, Jim, that soup's mighty thin. You need to eat more than that." And Judge Eggleston, in his younger days, I think in the same year, was amateur golf champion of Virginia, and I think amateur doubles tennis champion of Virginia. I mean, he was playing golf at 81 and shooting his age. I mean, tremendous athlete. I can remember talking to Judge Eggleston, and he was 81, about stocks. And I said, "Well, how do you know what stocks to buy?" "Well, I've been buying stocks." I said, "Well, when do you sell them?" He said, "I don't know. I've never sold one." So he was 81. Never sold a stock. He just bought them. But I mean, he was very gracious. He had my wife and I with his wife, Miss Eggleston, out to their country club, Virginia Beach, for dinner. But we had lunch every day. I can remember a car wouldn't start one morning. And so I hitchhiked in from Virginia Beach to Norfolk and got there about a half hour late and apologized. Told Judge Eggleston, he said, "Jim, why in the world didn't you just call me?" I said, "Nah, I'm coming to work." But he was very gracious, you know, in a lot of ways. For example, if I wrote one of my memorandums saying, "I think we ought to grant this, and here's why," or "you ought to." And anyway, if it was denied, then Judge Tom Gordon usually, and Red Eye Anson from Portsmouth would come over to Judge Eggleston's office and see the chief and senior to hear these, you know, to go over these, hear these arguments from when they wanted 3 judges. And in the conference, I was always in there with them when they decide. And Judge Eggleston would say, "Well, I don't think we all agree on this, but Jim thinks we should. Tell him why, Jim." And I'm a 23-year-old, and I'm telling these 2 justices why I think we ought to grant this writ. But Judge Eggleston, if we ever, if I said, he called me and he said, "Well, I don't think we're going to grant this, Jim. Do you think we should?" "Yes, sir, I do," because that's what I'd written. And he let me to tell these other judges why. And I'll never forget, one time I did, and I remember Tommy Gordon said, "Jack," they called him Jack, John, "Jack, I think we ought to take a look at this." And so, the darn thing was granted. But I mean, that was, and that's how he was treated me. made a great deal of difference in how my relationship with my law clerks on the Court of Appeals, to give them their say and listen. To give you an example of his, there was some evidentiary point that he wanted me to find, and I looked and looked, and I just could not find it. And I said, I've looked and looked, and he said, well, Jim, the facts of the case were it happened about 1947 or something. He said there was an automobile accident down and a woman was sitting on her front porch shucking peas, and that issue came up. So I go back to that year. I think it was a year off. Darned if I didn't find the case with a woman sitting on the front porch shucking peas, and it hadn't been properly set forth in the digest. But there it was. And another time he said, Jim, I need a case that says this. It wasn't one in Virginia. And I remember I went off to the Norfolk Public Law Library, which had a general digest. Probably nobody knows what that is anymore, but it was the digest of all of them. And looking for this point that he wanted a case, and darn if I didn't find it. Believe it or not, out of a lawsuit involving the Ernie Kovacs estate. Ernie Kovacs was a 1950s and early 60s comedian. And anyway, I found exactly what he wanted and brought it back from some court in Nevada or California somewhere. But he said, you can always find a case that says what you want. I never forgot that. And there it was. But he was a most gracious. I think y'all have a photograph of him holding my little daughter, Laura, and brought into the office. But he was a wonderful man and a good friend. But he was praying. He had two cases. I asked him one time, of which case are you most proud? And when the Prince William County schools were shut down in Virginia in 1963, I think it was 63, the question was, under the Constitution of Virginia, when Prince William said, we're not going to pay for public schools anymore, did the state have an obligation to pay for those schools? Not run the schools, but pay for them. And the Supreme Court said no with one dissent. It was Judge Eggleston. He said, we have a duty to make these schools available for these children. And if Prince William County won't pay for it, then the Constitution of Virginia guarantees an education. The legislature will pay for it. And I remember he told me he got letters from all over the country for that dissent. He was the only dissenter. And I remember he told me he got a letter from India. I remember him mentioning he got it from India, from somebody in India sending him a letter commenting on it. And of course he was right. And the other case in which he was the dissenter occurred when I was his law clerk, and that was, I think it's called Cradle v. Payton. But anyway, it was whether or not a kid in juvenile and domestic relations court had a right to court-appointed counsel. And again, the Virginia Supreme Court said no, and Judge Eggleston said yes, they do, under both the 14th Amendment and Virginia's Constitution. And I think he was the sole dissenter in that, and of course, he turned out absolutely right. And so his age, and he was a graduate of Washington Lee Law School, Hampton-Sydney and Washington Lee Law School. But, and certainly he was conservative in that book. I mean, he was 81. But when it came to the law and the rights of individuals and doing what's right, he always did, in my judgment. He's a great man.
Sounds like you had a wonderful experience with him.
Absolutely.
What interactions did you have with the other justices?
Well, you know, I had very little interaction, because only, you know, when in Richmond, when court was in session, I would come up usually on only a day that Judge Eggleston's cases were going to be heard. And so I would see them. But I had very little interaction with, I don't know whether, as I said, when we had 3-judge panels, if you will, usually Justice Gordon would come down from Richmond and Justice Hanson would come over from Portsmouth, and we'd meet in Judge Eggleston's office. So I got to know them well, as I got to know Justice Gordon. But I had very little interaction with any of the other justices. At that time, there was Albertus Harrison, who was down from, where was from? Vernon Spratley was from somewhere on the northern neck. Harry Carrico was from Fairfax. I'm trying to think who else was on the court at the time. Red Stevens. But anyway, no, I had very little. You know, and of course, there were no computers, no emails, you know, none of that, you know, at all. So it was Judge Eggleston, Miss Wynn, and myself. We were sort of down there alone.
So after your year, you decided it was time to move on, and
well, you're young and stupid, and I wanted to get going. Yeah.
And so what decision did you make after that?
I wanted to do trial work. I was from Arlington County. My parents lived there, and so I started as a platform. I was hired as an assistant Commonwealth attorney of Arlington County.
Why the prosecutor's office? Why not a law firm?
Well, because I knew I was going to be trying cases every day, and you sure were, day in, day out. I mean, you know, you try a lot of jury trials in a Arlington County prosecutor's office, and I knew the Commonwealth attorney. He was a legend up there, and so I tried cases.
And it sounds like you got a lot of good experience.
Oh yeah, I mean, you know.
So tell me what you learned from that.
How to recognize absolutely the elements and the soft points and hard points in a criminal case. I mean, you know, I can remember one morning, I didn't have a case. If you didn't have a jury trial, you went to General District Court. You did stuff in there. But I remember I walked in one morning and Bill Hassan, who was coming, said, "Jim," "Yes, sir." "You got a jury trial today?" I said, "No, sir, I'm going down General District Court." He said, "You do now," and handed me a file. You know, that's about 9 o'clock in the morning. Because whoever was going to try got sick. It was a breaking and entering. And so I had 1 hour to prepare to try this jury trial. And so, you know, you get the detective and, you know, try to convict the guy. And so you learn to put, and then for the same token, when you no longer prosecute defendant, you know what to do. You've learned a lot about what to do then. And so, it's, you know, great trying cases. You know, I wanted to, there's no better place to learn how to try cases than work for a Commonwealth attorney's office, because it's sink or swim. You know, you got to do it.
What were the things that perhaps challenged you the most as a prosecuting attorney?
Well, an assistant Commonwealth attorney is in a different position than a Commonwealth attorney, at least at that time in that office. I mean, you had no discretion in it. The Commonwealth attorney, he made all decisions, but you know what was going to be prosecuted at what level. In those days, I didn't have any authority to make a plea agreement. You know, that was all rested with Bill Hassan. And so, you know, you weren't talking to defense counsel, well, you know, if you want to plead to this, That had all been resolved. Try it. I don't know what I don't know. There were some very good circuit court judges. One in particular when I was in Arlington. One who was and remains a great friend, and that's a great judge, and that's Charles Russell, Justice Russell, who was interviewed, I understand. Very, very fine judge. And so I sort of grew up in those years, under Judge Russell. And he was my model of how to be a trial judge, Judge Russell.
Really? Explain.
Judge Russell was always my model.
Explain how he was your model. I mean, in what way? What did he do?
He was always gracious to the lawyers, but he was always prepared. Always prepared and very, very smart. Other model was Albert Bryan Jr., who, as a Fairfax Circuit Court judge and as a U.S. District Court judge, we talk about prepared. But Albert Bryan Jr., he knew more about your case than you did. And so Judge Russell, for his graciousness and his demeanor and how he handled himself, and Albert Bryan Jr. for being prepared. You know, when I was circuit court judge, I used to spend every other weekend, every other Monday was a motion stay, and I'd spend all weekend reviewing all my motions and researching them. Because when I was president, it used to drive you nuts on a motion stay when obviously the circuit court judge had never looked at the file, didn't know what you're talking about. And I vowed that I was going to know as much about these motions as the lawyers did, because I think you have that duty. I mean, they've gone to the effort to file it, brief it, argue it, and you ought to be prepared to intelligently evaluate it. Anyway, they were a model.
Did you have any cases that were particularly difficult or rewarding when you were a prosecuting attorney?
No, not that I particularly remember. There were so many breaking and entering, so many, robberies, so many, they're almost a blur. I remember a couple of them in detail, but no, I don't remember any one that was particularly. No, I don't.
So how long were you in that position?
3 years.
And what made you decide to leave?
Oh, I wanted to do some civil, and so I worked for a firm for a couple of years doing mainly civil insurance defense work and criminal defense work and trying cases.
And what firm was that?
It's called Ball, McCarthy, Ball and Cray,
and they were located where?
In Arlington, right around.
And what made you choose them?
Well, they sort of chose me. I was sort of looking around, and they sort of wanted me. I mean, they'd seen me in action, and law firms are always looking for, who's out there, and who do they know, who have they seen, work. And then I decided, well, I knew I could never afford a big house in Arlington, so I went to Fredericksburg in 1972. And with a law school buddy invited me down to be his partner, Bob Ackerman, who was in the House of Delegates at the time. And so Bob and I were together for, 72 to 79.
And so the practice was general?
Mm-hmm. I did a lot of criminal defense and a lot of plaintiffs. But yeah, general practice. And then in July 1, 73, I was Commonwealth's attorney and county attorney of King George County, and did that for 5 years.
Is this an elected position at the time?
I was appointed and then, yeah, and then elected. Because there was an interim, somebody quit. And that's where some of my dearest friends out of King George County, to this day, great dear friends. And then in '79, I moved to another law firm as a partner. And, you know, people, nobody ever gets tired of talking about themselves, but you get embarrassed. Must be better things. '79, I was named substitute judge, '85, General District Court judge, in the 15th Judicial Circuit, which is 10 counties in the city of Fredericksburg, an enormous circuit, including Hanover and Stafford, the entire northern neck. And then in '89, circuit court judge for the same circuit, but mainly in Stafford and King George. And then, so I did that for 16 years.
Now I'm going to back you up.
And then Court of Appeals.
So I'm going to back you up a little bit, and I want to find out how you segue from being in private practice to becoming a substitute judge and then these different judge positions. So what opportunities presented themselves and how do they present themselves?
Well, a substitute judge is appointed by the circuit court judges of the circuit. And so they, as did I, you evaluate the lawyers who appear before you. And if a position as a substitute judge opens up, there are a certain number of them, a lawyer might say, I'd be interested to be considered for it.
So what was it that they saw in the kind of law you were practicing that attracted them?
I wish I knew. I have no idea. But I think, when I looked at it, I wanted a lawyer who I respected because I thought he knew the law and I thought he had some judgment. I mean, you know, substitute judges, they're making decisions just like, you know, they're of course not of record, but they're making serious decisions, and sure you want somebody, you know, you think knew the law and who you like. And I presume that's what they did. And then, so I was substitute judge for 6 years. And by that time, by the same token, then the Bar Association and the lawyers get to see, well, how's he doing? You know, and I sat a whole lot because we had a judge who was sick, basically, physically sick. And so they get to evaluate you, you know, and they say, well, you know. And so then when it comes time for the legislature to elect you or not, it used to be, I don't think it means anything anymore, but it used to be the local bar endorsement was what it was all about. I don't think that means much anymore. But I've always thought nobody knows better as to who should be judge than the lawyer you've practiced with. I mean, you know, you don't want a judge who's a dummy. They make exceptions like me sometimes. But you want to, you know, you want somebody who you think knows what the law is and will be fair. And nobody knows that better than your brother and sister lawyers. Nobody knows better. And so they practice the law on a substitute judge, and then it comes to a recommendation to the legislature, and you know, there are races, and the bar endorsed me.
Now, when you were working as...
And then, again, then you're a General District Court judge. Same thing. Well, circuit court judge says, well, do we want this guy to be a circuit court judge or not? Okay.
So when you were working as a substitute judge, and especially the first time you found yourself on the bench, what was that like?
It's very interesting. Interestingly enough, the first case I ever heard as a substitute judge ended up for the denial of a writ of certiorari in the United States Supreme Court. First case ever heard. Isn't that strange? Anyway, the thing you realize very quickly, you better realize it very quickly, is that you hear the evidence, but you're not an advocate. You're not an advocate. You know, you've been an advocate practicing law, always been an advocate, but you're not there. And you say, well, gee, this guy ought to win, but the evidence just isn't there. You know, you do that. And the hardest thing, as a circuit court judge, something that came out of a case in George County, the hardest thing is, it's your responsibility as a judge to know the law. But suppose, in an important, the lawyers don't. And suppose this point of law really helps one side, hurts the other. What is your duty? Now, if you're sitting without a jury, that's one thing. But with a jury, that is the hardest thing. You cannot interject yourself into the case. The case that I'm talking about was a jury trial in which, sadly, a little boy really had been thrown off a hay wagon and run over and killed when the hay shifted. And the plaintiff's lawyer, there's a statute that I knew about, which requires you, on any load that may shift, keep it so it won't shift. It's almost what's called almost per se. A violation of it is negligence. This plaintiff's lawyer didn't know about that law, and I did. But I got a jury, and I remember just agonizing. What is my duty as judge? I mean, that's the law. And he was too dumb, he didn't know it. And I remember agonizing at lunch. Oh my goodness. Am I supposed to say, here's what the law is, when that lawyer doesn't know it? Or is that, I mean, it's going to really hurt one side, really help another? And I concluded it's not, with a jury trial, it's not for me to interject into it. But I agonized over that and then, thank goodness, at lunch they settled it. So I never had to really put that to, they settled the case at lunch. But that is a hard decision. Now, that's not the case with criminal law. I mean, criminal law, if defense counsel is, dumb as a box of rocks, you got to step in there and look out for the defendant a little bit if they just don't know what they're doing or don't understand.
Did you have a number of cases like that?
Oh yeah, you have a number. You have some, and it's, you have to remember, everybody was a young lawyer once. Everybody, once didn't know, didn't have the experience, and so if it's a criminal case, you got to look out for the defendant. I mean, you can't let somebody get convicted when the evidence or the law is not on the Commonwealth's side, just because his lawyer is inexperienced, let us say. I mean, you have a duty. That's another thing. People, when a Commonwealth's attorney has a duty to do justice for the Commonwealth. You are the attorney for the Commonwealth. You are not the victim's attorney. You are not representing the victim in that sense of the word, like a personal injury case. You are representing justice, and you have to do and make the decisions that you think are right in the interest of the Commonwealth. And often, you know, your heart goes out to victims, obviously, and it should, but you have a duty to do justice, and that means you don't indict somebody for something that you know isn't right, and you can never convict them of it. That's, you know, you have a duty to represent the Commonwealth, for whatever that's worth.
So when you were a substitute judge, did you find yourself really gravitating more towards remaining as a judge in some capacity?
Yeah, I enjoy that experience very much. And also, Plato said that defined a sophist, S-O-P-H, as one who tries to make the worst case appear the better. Well, that's what you do as a lawyer. You know, you are an advocate. You're supposed to. Or a criminal defense attorney, plaintiffs, that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to represent your client as best you can, you know, within ethical bounds, obviously. But I got thinking, you know, I'm more comfortable trying to decide what's the right thing than advocating one side or the other. And I think I learned that as a substitute judge. You know, I know it sounds silly, but you got a chance to do some good, you know, for justice as opposed for just my client, and that, you know. And so I think you're very incisive. That substitute judge. Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, that's what I want to do.
So how did you let that be known that you were interested?
Well, we had a journalistic judge retire. Retire. And I let the bar know I'd be interested in doing it, and the bar endorsed me, and the legislature elected me. I've been elected by various positions by 3 Democratic legislatures and 3 Republican legislatures.
So what you're saying is that both political parties recognized that you were after justice and balance.
Well, I'd be hard pressed to say what any political party recognizes, but at least the legislature elected me. So I don't know.
Have you found any significant differences in perhaps the adjustment to being from a substitute judge to the various judge levels, that there were challenges that you didn't anticipate?
Well, I think when you go from substitute judge to be a full-time general district court judge, it depends on where you are. At that time and to this day, Stafford County is significantly understaffed with judges. I mean, I was the only general district court judge for 2 counties, Stafford and King George. And so you'd have, and it got almost impossible. Now I think they have 4, I think now, but I mean, you'd have dockets running till 7 and 8 o'clock at night, from 9 in the morning, simply because I mean, not every week, but more than occasionally, to way late. And so that, and also general district court judge, how many times do you want to hear, well, the radar was wrong, or, I only had 2 beers. I mean, after a while, and also general district court judge, By the circuit court, then you've got an enormous amount of work to do. Because if you're going to try a case, I mean, I always thought, you know, you know what it's going to be like, what the case is about, but you ought to do your homework, do research, et cetera, and obviously know what's in the file, so you can do a good job. So you're not just, you know, sitting there without knowing, and that requires a lot of work to do that. I mean, criminal law, you get so you know that because there's so many, and you've done so much as a district court judge. But the civil side of it, you have a lot of work to do. And if you're going to do a good job, and that requires doing your homework. And that's certainly true on the Court of Appeals. For example, you know, workman's comp law, you know, no circuit court judge ever, you know, you don't have anything to do with that. And very seldom do you have much administrative law except for appeals from administrative agency, very seldom. And so those two very prominent areas of our Court of Appeals practice is something you got to study, you got to learn, and that.
So did you find that your days were longer because of the research that was needed to prepare for these cases?
No, you mean in circuit court?
Circuit court versus district court.
No, I didn't find that, although I can remember trying a case till 4 a.m. simply because a couple times, well after midnight, I remember 10, 15 times after midnight with a jury. Because I was the only circuit court judge in 2 jurisdictions. And so you got cases set every day. And so if you don't get through this one, then you got to continue the next one. And you know, that's not fair for the lawyers. They got witnesses subpoenaed. They, you know, got everybody ready to go to try a jury trial. And you call them and say, sorry, it's off. You know, you try to accommodate them. And so the days weren't longer because you could do that preparation beforehand. District court judges volume, just so many cases that you got to hear.
So tell me about the process between being a circuit court judge and an appeals court judge. What went on, and how did you find yourself nominated?
Well, happened very quickly. I received a call from a lady in the staff for the legislature asking if I'd like to appear the next day before courts of justice, the House and Senate, and for a position on the Court of Appeals. And I had made known I'd like that position earlier time, and I said, okay, yeah. And so I came down and appeared before those 2 committees, and a couple days later, I was an adjunct professor at Mary Washington University, teaching at night, which is sort of fun. You have kids, some of them like to learn. And I was there teaching away at night, and my wife stuck her head in the door and said, I think you're elected. Goodness. And so I was. And so all of a sudden, I didn't have an office. I'd had a wonderful, dear, dear secretary all those years, 17 years, who came over with me to be secretary, administrative assistant. She did everything. Named was Sonia Courtney, who I love dearly. And Sonia was with me until I retired had to retire. But I didn't have an office. And And so I'm scrambling around trying to find some place to rent. And so they set up an office in my house, basically. You know, hooked me up with the computer and, you know, the email and so I don't know, 3 or 4 months later, I finally found an office, which interestingly enough had been Judge Willis's office when he was on the Court of Appeals, and is now Judge McCullough's office. So the same place. And so anyway, so I went up to Alexandria and heard a panel argue the matter up there. Bob Humphreys, Joanna Fitzpatrick, and Mac Willis were on the panel. And then I came down here, and Bob Humphreys and Bob Frank talked to me for about an hour and gave me a Court of Appeals policy manual, and 2 weeks later I was in Alexandria hearing a case. So I didn't have law clerks, and I didn't. And so I had to put it together, And so that first, months, I didn't have an office, didn't have any law clerks, didn't have anywhere to put them if I hired them. And but I've been very lucky with my law clerks.
Now it sounds like that was a big transition year for you, and
yeah, it sure was.
And so what challenges did you have when you were trying to hear some of these cases?
Well, immediately after I was appointed, I started reading, for the last 5 years, every workman's comp and every, I knew criminal law, I did a lot of that. And I knew domestic relations because I had so many of those cases. I mean, I knew it. Certainly not in the detail that you need to know on the Court of Appeals. But I went back and read every case for the last 5, 6, maybe 10 years. Every workers' comp case and every administrative law case from the Court of Appeals. I mean, if I'm going to do that, I better find out what's going on, and so I did. So I spent, all the time reading those cases to see, what. And anyway, that's what I did. Published and unpublished. I think I can't remember. I know 5 years, it might have been more. But I know I read every published and unpublished opinion.
How long did that take?
Oh, gee, months. Months. I mean, that's all I did. I didn't wasn't reading any literature. I was reading those cases to try to get up to speed on those 2 areas of law.
And how useful was that for you, especially that first year?
Oh, very useful. Oh, yeah, I mean, it had to be done. I mean...
Give me an example.
Well, okay. When I was circuit court judge, if you'd asked me, what deference do you give on an appeal for a workman's compensation decision, or should the Workman's Compensation Commission give, what deference should you give to the opinion of the treating physician? Well, now, if you'd ask me that, I'd say, I have absolutely no idea, because you never have a workers' comp case. I mean, I defended a couple for insurance companies, but it was always at the lawyer. And so I have no idea what to say, but I learned and give them a great deal of deference. So if I got a case coming up, I'm not sure that deference is justified, but that's another story. But no, that's an example. In administrative law, administrative law is, if you'd asked me, I did have a circuit court judge, 5, 6, 7 cases, appeals from administrative agencies, but to circuit court, but from the appellate level of it. So I had to get up to speed on that. Of course, there aren't that many cases. But, of course, I got guidance from time to time from the Court of Appeals itself when I was a circuit court judge. Some I appreciated, some I didn't, but that was their decision, not mine.
So what was the relationship like between you and the other judges on the Court of Appeals?
Wonderful. Wonderful. I mean, just, my goodness, the greatest respect for them, and indeed almost love. I just thought the world of still do, of my colleagues on the Court of Appeals. I mean, some are not there. Joanna is no longer with the court, and Justice Powell, Liz, they're all in the Supreme Court now. So and Jim Benton retired, he was a wonderful guy. And so it's, just in my 5 years, it changed, but no, just the greatest respect for them, and very able and very hardworking. I mean, I knew a number of circuit court judges over the years who I thought were just lazy. I mean, nice men and women, but just lazy. And that was their reputation around the state. I mean, among the lawyers but nobody